In 1941, Europe was in a tense situation. World War II was already raging across the continent. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had conquered much of Europe. But there was one powerful country he had not yet touched: the Soviet Union. Despite having a non-aggression pact signed in 1939, Hitler had his eyes on the Soviet lands. He wanted more territory, resources, and to defeat what he saw as his ideological enemy. Key people played major roles in these secret plans. Adolf Hitler was the German leader, determined to expand his empire. On the Soviet side, Joseph Stalin was in charge, ruling with an iron fist. Stalin knew that Germany could be a threat, but he hoped the non-aggression pact would buy him time. Meanwhile, in the German military, officers like Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch and General Franz Halder were organizing the planned invasion. They called it Operation Barbarossa. The story starts with meticulous planning by the Germans. They prepared to invade the Soviet Union with over 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft. The plan was to break the Soviet Union into pieces quickly. The Germans aimed to reach key cities like Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev fast, hoping to force the Soviet army into surrender before winter. Technically, this was a big challenge. Moving such a large army needed a lot of coordination. The Germans used their famous tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was all about speed and surprise. Tanks would push through enemy lines, supported by aircraft from above, and the infantry would follow to consolidate the gains. Communication was crucial. The Germans used radio to coordinate their moves, while the Soviet forces were often slower, relying on older methods like wired telephones, which couldn't keep up with the rapid changes on the battlefield. But, despite the careful planning, there were problems. The first challenge was the massive distance the Germans needed to cover. The Soviet Union was vast, and the roads were not great, especially as they headed deeper into Soviet territory. Weather was another major problem. German troops were not prepared for the harsh Russian winter. Supplies were hard to deliver over such long distances. The quick victory they hoped for was slipping away as the Soviet soldiers fiercely defended their land. When the invasion finally happened on June 22, 1941, it started well for Germany. They caught the Soviet forces by surprise, and progress seemed fast at first. But soon, things bogged down. The German forces faced stubborn resistance, along with those logistical nightmares. The Soviet Union, despite Stalin's initial hesitation, managed to mobilize and push back harder than expected. By the time winter set in, the German advance had come to a freezing halt, and their soldiers were not ready for the cold. So, what happened because of this? Operation Barbarossa was one of the largest military operations in history, and it marked the beginning of a brutal conflict on the Eastern Front. Millions of soldiers and civilians suffered horribly. The Soviet Union eventually pushed the Germans back, leading to the long and devastating fight that would leave deep marks on both countries. Why does this matter today? Operation Barbarossa was a turning point in World War II. It showed the dangers of underestimating an enemy and highlighted the importance of logistics and preparation in warfare. The huge losses and suffering it caused still impact Russia and Germany today. Understanding this event helps us learn about the consequences of aggressive expansion and the importance of peace and diplomacy in avoiding massive conflicts. In the early morning of June 22, 1941, something big started in Europe. It was called Operation Barbarossa, and it was when Nazi Germany decided to invade the Soviet Union. This was the biggest land invasion in history up to that point. So, why did this happen? Before this, Germany and the Soviet Union were not exactly friends, but they had a secret pact called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This agreement, made in 1939, meant they would not fight each other and even divided up parts of Eastern Europe for themselves. But Adolf Hitler, who was Germany's leader, decided he wanted more. He saw the Soviet Union as weak and thought he could grab its land and resources. He underestimated the Soviets, and this decision led to some big changes in World War II. Adolf Hitler was the main person behind this plan. He thought the German army could take over quickly. On the other side was Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin did not believe the warnings that Germany would attack, so the Soviets were caught by surprise. So, what actually happened when the invasion started? On June 22nd, German forces moved across the Soviet border. They had a plan called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war in German. This was a way of fighting that used surprise, speed, and coordination. Germany used tanks, planes, and soldiers all at once to overwhelm their enemies. They had more than 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft all moving fast into Soviet territory. The attack began along a 1,800-mile front, stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The Germans quickly gained ground, capturing huge areas and taking many Soviet soldiers prisoner. This sudden and massive move showed the power of the Blitzkrieg strategy. However, the Germans faced problems too. For one, the Soviet Union was vast. The distances were huge, which meant it was tough for the German army to keep up with supplies like food, fuel, and ammunition. The roads were not great, and the harsh weather made things even worse. For the Soviet side, the surprise was a massive challenge. They were not ready, and their equipment was outdated. But they had many more soldiers. Even as they retreated, they kept resisting and made the Germans fight for every inch. Eventually, the invasion slowed. By winter, the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow, but could not capture the city. The freezing cold, snow, and lack of supplies hurt the German soldiers, who were not prepared for the Soviet winter. Why should we care about this today? Operation Barbarossa changed the course of World War II. It turned the Soviet Union into a key player who would later help defeat Nazi Germany. This invasion also showed the brutal reality of war, with millions of lives lost and affected. It reminds us how leaders' decisions can change the world, and why it's important to understand our history to avoid repeating its mistakes. In short, Operation Barbarossa was one day that sparked a huge change in the war. It showed both the power and the limits of military might and taught lessons that still matter today. In the summer of 1941, Germany began an enormous military attack against the Soviet Union. This was called Operation Barbarossa. To understand why this happened, we need to look at what was going on before it all started. World War II was raging across Europe. Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, had already taken control of much of Western Europe. Hitler's plan was to expand Germany's territory, and he saw the Soviet Union as a huge next step. Adolf Hitler was the main person behind this plan. He wanted more land for Germany and believed that conquering the Soviet Union would help achieve that. On the other side was Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin had made a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939, which meant they agreed not to attack each other. But Hitler broke this agreement with Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched a surprise attack. Over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft crossed into Soviet territory. This was a military tactic known as Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war in German. The idea was to strike quickly and hard before the enemy could react. Troops moved fast and used radio to coordinate attacks from the ground and air. At first, the Blitzkrieg tactic worked incredibly well. German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast areas and many Soviet soldiers. They seemed unstoppable. One of the reasons for their success was their tanks. German tanks, like the Panzer IV, weighed around 25 tons, and their cannons could shoot shells 75 millimeters wide. These tanks were quick and powerful, making it easier for German forces to push forward. However, there were major challenges. For one, the Soviet Union is a gigantic country, and the further German troops moved in, the harder it was to supply them with food and ammunition. Bad roads and harsh weather conditions like muddy terrain slowed them down. Another problem was the resilience of the Soviet people and soldiers. Despite suffering massive losses, they refused to give up. As summer turned to winter, things got even tougher for the German forces. They were not well prepared for the extreme cold. Their equipment and weapons started to malfunction, and many soldiers didn't have proper winter clothing. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, accustomed to its own winters, launched counterattacks. Despite the early successes, Operation Barbarossa eventually stalled, and by December 1941, the Germans found themselves struggling. This failure marked a turning point in the war. For the first time, the Germans lost their advantage. It forced them to fight on two fronts, the Soviets in the east and the Allies in the west. Understanding Operation Barbarossa helps us see why this was a critical moment in World War II. It shows how overconfidence and poor planning can lead to failure, even when things seem to be going well at first. The operation also highlights the massive human cost of war, as millions of people were displaced or lost their lives during this conflict. Today, Operation Barbarossa is a reminder of the impact of unchecked ambition and the dangers of breaking agreements. It is a lesson in the importance of considering the long-term consequences of actions, both in war and in our everyday lives. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched an attack on the Soviet Union called Operation Barbarossa. This was part of World War II when things were heating up in Europe. Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, surprised many by breaking a pact with the Soviet Union that said they would not fight each other. Hitler wanted more space and resources for Germany, and he thought attacking the Soviets would be easy. But the Soviets were not going to give up without a fight. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union, and he was caught off guard by the attack. There were reports of German plans, but Stalin did not take them seriously at first. When the Germans invaded, they sent millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks across the Soviet border. Stalin and his generals, including Georgy Zhukov, had to figure out how to stop them. The first months were really tough for the Soviets. The German forces moved fast and took over large areas of land. But the Soviet Union was huge, and the weather would soon work against the Germans. By autumn, the famous Russian winter was beginning to set in. With temperatures dropping, the Germans faced serious problems. Their equipment was not made for such cold weather. Tanks and trucks broke down, and soldiers struggled to keep warm. The Soviet people and the Red Army showed incredible resilience. They had to fight not only against a powerful enemy, but also against hunger and cold. Many Soviet citizens took to the defense of their cities and towns. In Moscow, people dug trenches and set up defenses. The Battle of Moscow was one significant event where the Soviets managed to hold their ground. A key factor in the Soviet fight back was the T-34 tank. It was tough, reliable, and could work well in difficult conditions. The T-34 had thick armor and a 76.2 millimeter gun that could take out German tanks. While the Germans had their advanced machines, the T-34's design and the determination of its crew gave the Soviets an advantage. Factories worked around the clock building more of these tanks. Another important moment was the Battle of Stalingrad, which started in August 1942. It was one of the war's biggest and bloodiest fights. The city was bombed heavily, and the fight went street by street. The The Soviet forces, under leaders like Vasily Chuikov, held on despite terrible conditions. They used the city's ruins to their advantage, making it hard for the Germans to advance. The German army was not prepared for such fierce resistance or the harsh winter. Their supply lines were too long, and they began to run out of resources. By February 1943, at Stalingrad, the German army had no choice but to surrender. This marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The Soviets started pushing back, regaining lost land over the next years. The Soviet fight back matters today because it showed how determination and resilience can overcome even the toughest challenges. It changed the course of World War II and shaped the world we live in now. Understanding the courage and hard work of those who lived and fought during this time helps us appreciate the strength needed to face adversity. In 1941, Europe was in turmoil. World War II was raging, and Germany had already conquered much of the continent. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, had a bold plan. He wanted to capture the Soviet Union's capital, Moscow. This plan was called Operation Barbarossa, and it led to one of the most important battles of the war, the Battle of Moscow. Before this battle, things were not looking good for the Soviet Union. The German army was strong and had advanced quickly. They had thousands of tanks, airplanes, and soldiers. They moved fast, and by the fall of 1941, they were getting close to Moscow. Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was worried. He knew Moscow was important. If Germany captured the city, it could mean the end for the Soviet Union. Now, let's talk about the key people. Adolf Hitler was leading the German forces. He was confident and thought his army could win easily. On the Soviet side, there was Joseph Stalin. He was under a lot of pressure. Another important figure was General Georgy Zhukov. He played a big part in planning the Soviet defense and would become famous for his role in protecting Moscow. The Battle of Moscow began in October 1941. The Germans started their attack with a lot of force. They used tanks, which were like big moving guns, and they also used airplanes to bomb the city. The German strategy was to strike fast, hoping to take Moscow before winter came. But the Soviet army put up a strong fight. They set up defensive lines and used every available soldier to slow down the Germans. One of the biggest challenges was the weather. By November, temperatures were dropping fast. The ground turned to mud, which was a problem for the German tanks and vehicles. Then the snow came, and it was bitterly cold. The German soldiers were not prepared for the freezing temperatures. Their equipment froze, and they struggled to move. The Soviets, on the other hand, were used to the cold. They knew how to handle it and used it to their advantage. Despite the harsh conditions, the Soviets launched a major counterattack in early December 1941. General Zhukov's plan was to push the Germans back. He gathered all the reinforcements he could and struck hard. The Soviet soldiers, with their warm clothing and knowledge of the land, fought fiercely. This surprised the Germans, who were already struggling with the cold and lack of supplies. By the end of the year, the Soviet Union had managed to push the German forces away from Moscow. It was a huge relief for the Soviet people and a significant setback for Germany. The Germans had been stopped just short of their goal and were forced to retreat. This battle was a turning point in World War II. It showed that the German army could be stopped and that the Soviet Union was not going to give up easily. It also marked the beginning of a long and difficult conflict on the Eastern Front, which ultimately stretched German resources. So, why does this matter today? The Battle of Moscow is a lesson in resilience and strategy. It showed how important it is to be prepared for challenges like harsh weather and to understand your enemy's weaknesses. It's one of those moments in history where determination and smart planning changed the course of a massive conflict. reminding us about the importance of standing firm even when things seem impossible. In June 1941, Germany made a daring move by launching Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II. It was the largest military operation in history, involving about 3 million German soldiers. Adolf Hitler believed that by invading the Soviet Union, Germany could gain more land, resources, and power. But as the months dragged on, the German troops hit an unexpected and chilling barrier: the harsh Russian winter. The main people involved in Operation Barbarossa were Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Hitler wanted a quick victory, expecting the Soviet forces to collapse in just a few months. On the Soviet side, Stalin first refused to believe the invasion was happening, which led to chaos at the start. When the Germans first invaded, they advanced rapidly. Thanks to blitzkrieg tactics, fast, powerful attacks using tanks and planes, they captured large areas of Soviet territory. The German army seemed unstoppable. But then, as the cold months rolled in, things changed dramatically. Russian winters were famous for being incredibly tough. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees in some places, which the German troops were not prepared for. Unlike the Soviets, who were used to these conditions, German forces struggled. Their equipment and weapons failed in the freezing temperatures. Guns and tanks stopped working because oil would freeze or engines would not start. German soldiers did not have the right winter clothing, leading to frostbite and hypothermia. Another problem was the vastness and emptiness of the Russian steppes. These wide-open spaces made it hard for the Germans to keep supply lines open. Food and fuel shortages became common, making it even harder for German troops to survive and fight effectively. Soviet forces, on the other hand, were able to regroup and counterattack. They were more accustomed to the freezing climate and had better supplies and equipment suited to the cold. The arrival of fresh Soviet divisions from Siberia, well-trained in winter warfare, turned the tide against the Germans. The end result was a significant strategic failure for Germany. The offensive stalled, and the troops were stuck in a brutal winter with dwindling resources. This marked a turning point in World War II. The failure of Operation Barbarossa allowed the Soviet Union to launch major offensives in the following years, eventually pushing back the Germans all the way to Berlin by 1945. Today, looking back at the story of Operation Barbarossa and the harsh Russian winter reminds us why it is important to be prepared for challenges, no matter how invincible one might feel. The German army's underestimation of the Russian winter showed that nature can be as formidable an enemy as any army. This serves as a reminder that hubris, or overconfidence, can lead to downfall. It is also a lesson in the importance of understanding the conditions of the environment where battles, or any significant endeavors, take place. Understanding these events helps us better appreciate the complex factors that shape historical outcomes and see how they still influence the world today. In 1941, something big happened. It was the middle of World War II, and Germany decided to launch a huge attack on the Soviet Union. This operation was called Operation Barbarossa. Before this, Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact in 1939, meaning they had agreed not to attack each other. But that agreement did not last long. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, wanted more land and resources, and he saw the Soviet Union as a massive prize. Key people played big roles in this event. Adolf Hitler was the one who planned the attack. On the other side, Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union. He was caught by surprise when the attack happened because he thought the non-aggression pact would keep them safe. On June 22, 1941, Germany sent over 3 million soldiers into the Soviet Union. This was one of the largest invasions in history. They used tanks, planes, and other military equipment to try to take control quickly. The plan was to crush the Soviet army and capture big cities like Moscow and Leningrad before winter hit. Technically speaking, Germany used a tactic called blitzkrieg, which means lightning war in German. This meant they moved really fast and hit hard, trying to overwhelm the enemy quickly. They used tanks called panzers and aircraft like the Messerschmitt fighter planes to attack swiftly and create chaos. However, things did not go as smoothly as Germany planned. They faced several challenges. One big problem was logistics, which means the supply and transport of food, fuel, and ammunition. The Soviet Union was vast, with harsh weather and poor roads, making it tough for Germany to keep up their momentum. Another major issue was the resistance from the Soviet army. Despite being surprised, Soviet soldiers fought back fiercely. Many civilians also joined in the fight to defend their land, adding pressure on the invading forces. The invasion led to massive human suffering. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Cities were destroyed, and many people, especially Jews, were victims of the Nazis' brutal policies. The winter of 1941 made things even worse for the German soldiers, who were not prepared for the freezing temperatures and snow. As a result of these challenges, Germany could not achieve a quick victory. Instead of capturing cities like Moscow, they got stuck in difficult battles. This failure forced Germany to rethink its strategy. Over time, this became a turning point in the war. The Soviet Union began to push back, launching counteroffensives that eventually contributed to Germany's defeat in World War II. Why does Operation Barbarossa matter today? It showed the dangers of underestimating an enemy and failing to plan for big challenges like weather and logistics. It also highlighted the immense human cost that war can bring, with countless lives lost and communities torn apart. Understanding these events helps us remember the past and learn important lessons about conflict, strategy, and human resilience. In early 1941, Europe was deep in the chaos of World War II. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, had already taken over much of the continent. But he wanted more. His next big target was the Soviet Union, a massive country with huge resources that stretched from Europe to Asia. Hitler thought he could conquer it quickly, just like he had done with other countries. His plan was called Operation Barbarossa. A few key people played major roles in this enormous military campaign. Adolf Hitler, of course, was the one who ordered it. He believed this invasion would destroy the Soviet Union quickly. On the Soviet side, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was caught off guard. He did not expect Hitler to break their non-aggression pact, a promise not to attack each other. Commanders on both sides had to make big decisions in a short time. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers, along with tanks and airplanes, attacked the Soviet Union along a huge front line. This front stretched about 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. German tanks rolled in fast, and their planes bombed Soviet targets. At first, it seemed like the Germans might succeed. They advanced quickly, capturing massive areas and taking many Soviet soldiers as prisoners. The Germans used a strategy called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This meant they attacked fast and hard, aiming to overwhelm the enemy before they could react. Their tanks, known as panzer divisions, spearheaded the attack, while airplanes provided cover from above. This approach worked well in smaller countries, but faced difficulties in the vast Soviet lands. However, problems soon followed. The Soviet Union was enormous, and conquering it was much harder than Hitler anticipated. The Soviet army, despite being pushed back initially, started to resist fiercely. Weather also took its toll. The German advance slowed, as the hot summer turned into a wet autumn, and then a brutally cold winter. The German soldiers were not prepared for these harsh conditions. Their equipment often failed in the extreme cold, and many soldiers suffered from frostbite. By the end of 1941, Operation Barbarossa had stalled just outside of Moscow, the Soviet capital. What started as a confident invasion turned into a long, grueling battle. German troops were exhausted, and their supply lines were stretched too thin. In contrast, the Soviet Union began to regroup and fight back stronger than ever. The failure of Operation Barbarossa had long-lasting impacts. It marked a turning point in World War II. Instead of a quick victory, Nazi Germany found itself in a prolonged and draining war on the Eastern Front. This would become one of the most brutal parts of the entire conflict. The Soviet Union's fight back played a huge role in weakening Nazi Germany, helping the Allied forces eventually win the war. Today, we should care about Operation Barbarossa because it reminds us how dangerous it is when leaders become too ambitious and underestimate the challenges they face. It also shows the importance of resilience and determination. The Soviet Union, underestimated and attacked, managed to turn the tide of the war. This part of history helps us understand why planning and respecting agreements are crucial on the global stage. Understanding these events is important for ensuring such large-scale conflicts are avoided in the future.